broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this CECAN webinar. My name is Martha Bickett, and I'm a CECAN researcher at University of Surrey, and I'll be chairing today's webinar with Dr. Martine Barons. For those of you who haven't joined us before, CECAN stands for Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. We're a research centre funded by a group of research councils, government departments and agencies. Our aim is to test and promote innovative evaluation methods, so methods that take into account and are appropriate for the complexity of the world around us. We're looking in particular at nexus issues, so those are the interlinked areas of food, energy, water and environment. If you want to find out more about what we've been up to, including our contributions around the latest update of the UK Treasury Magenta book on evaluation, read our manifesto called Policy Evaluation for a Complex World. And that is available in the resources section on our website, cecan.ac.uk. So today's webinar is all about evaluating food security policy. Our speaker is Dr. Martine Barons. Martine is Director of the Applied Statistics and Risk Unit at University of Warwick. So Martine's going to speak to us for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have until 11 for Q&A. Please submit your questions for Martine via the question box, which you should be able to see on the GoToWebinar control panel, which popped up when you joined the webinar. And then as chair, I'll post those to Martine. So please feel free to type those in and submit them at any point during the webinar today, all the way up to the very end. The session will be recorded and should be made available, pending no technical difficulties, on the CECAN website afterwards. So it's my great pleasure now to welcome and pass you over to Dr. Martine Barons. And if I just get this set up, I'll pass over to you. There we are, Martine.
Good morning, everyone. Can you see my screen now?
That looks perfect.
Excellent, excellent. So the Applied Statistics and Risk Unit has been developed to enable the early application of theoretical developments for the benefit of society. I did my PhD as a mature student, having a background in business accountancy and auditing, which gave me an insight into the business imperatives, and it helps me enable that translation between academia and business. My own research is in decision support systems, and I engage with local county councils around policies for ameliorating food insecurity. So firstly, what is food insecurity? So this is the World Food Summit definition, which most people in the research space use, when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain an active and healthy life. That sounds easy enough, doesn't it? But it does include things like physical and economic access to food. It meets their dietary needs as well as their food preferences. And this is usually taken to include any cultural requirements that people might have. So it's not sufficient simply to provide calories and micronutrients. It has to be done in a way which gives dignity and it gives autonomy to the people who are eating. There is also the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. So this has been ratified by a number of countries, a large number of countries in fact, and it guarantees the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger and obliges state parties to take steps in this regard. Now, many people in the human rights domain consider that the UK government is failing in this regard, since the welfare state no longer provides a robust last line of defence against hunger. As with all complex systems, there is a question of what scale are you looking at it. So the Global Food Security Index looks at country level food security, and it considers these things: the affordability of the food, the availability of the food, the quality and safety of the food, and a new category is the natural resource and resilience. So it thinks about things like how food consumption is a share of household expenditure, how many of the population are under global poverty, what is the gross domestic product per capita, any agricultural import tariffs, access to finance for farmers, particularly for innovation, and the presence of a food safety net. Availability just thinks about calories per capita per day and public expenditure on agricultural R&D. It also thinks about the infrastructure, the ability to store and transport crops, because this is a problem in some countries, and also the volatility of agricultural production, which is not independent, obviously, of the resilience element here. Political instability is very important, of course, as is corruption, and urban absorption. How many people are being absorbed into the cities? How many are moving there? I think we have fully 50% of the world's population living in cities, the last time I looked at the stats. And so that can have implications on people's access to food. If the food is being grown elsewhere, then with a good infrastructure, that's not a problem. But if the infrastructure is poor, that makes a big difference. And also how much food is lost. So post-harvest losses, how much food that could be eaten when it's first harvested is unfit for human consumption by the time it gets to the people. Then the quality and safety aspect looks at how diverse the diet is, the nutritional standards and the micronutrient availability, not just the calories. And what is the quality of the protein and how safe is the food? What are the food safety nets and so on? And so the new resilience is about how variable the weather is and the climate and how resilient that is. We all know that there are countries that suffer 10 years of droughts and then everything gets washed away in a flood. How are we enabling communities and countries to be able to be resilient in those circumstances by having appropriate things in place to do irrigation perhaps or water capture or whatever, how people are adapting, how well that's being done. So here we have the top 10, and we see Ireland is at the top, United States, United Kingdom, Australia and Canada all in the top 10, and there's really not a huge amount between those 10. 81.7 is the score for Sweden and 85.6 is the score for Ireland. That's really a whisker in the grand scheme of things. So we could say that all of those countries are highly food secure. However, when we look at household level, a different picture emerges. So we look at these 4 countries, these are the ones that I know most about, and a recent study, Food and You, estimated that 13% of the UK population are marginally food secure and 8% are low or very low food secure. What does that mean? Well, usually the standard measure is the USDA Household Food Security questionnaire, and that has 18 questions. And that categorizes people into food secure, marginally food secure, low food secure, or very low food secure. Now, the food secure people, that's obvious. No, people don't have any trouble in being able to access the food that they want to eat. Marginally food secure, people haven't got to the point of changing their diet yet, but they are worried about making ends meet. So there's an anxiety element there. So low food secure are the people who started to change their diet. Perhaps they've just reduce the range of things that they eat, or perhaps they've gone to the very cheap version. So we're thinking in the UK, the budget pasta, the budget tuna, and so on. And they're eating perhaps a lot of repetitive things, and they wouldn't, for example, buy the broccoli that was on offer because they couldn't be sure the children would eat it, so they stick to buying carrots. So they have a much less varied diet. And then the very low food secure, these are the people who are actually starting to skip meals. Skip meals, sometimes go for a whole day without food. We can see that across all 4 countries that gender has an impact. So women tend to be more food insecure than men. Single-headed households are more food insecure. Low-income people are more food insecure, as you might expect. And work status has an impact. It's not just the amount of money that you earn as well. This is an interesting thing which emerged recently. So the financial diaries were kept in the USA, and they found that the volatility with which you earn your money is very significant. So if there's more than a 25% change between pay packets, then even though across the year somebody might have a median income, then actually they are much more likely to suffer with food and other kinds of insecurities, financial problems. So this has impact, obviously, for things like the gig economy that is emerging and how we're protecting workers in that sense. Looking then on to Australia, their estimate is 4%, but they're not using the 18-question module here. They're using a single question. So this is most likely to pick up only those who are the most food insecure. So again, there's the Indigenous and culturally linguistically diverse people and socially isolated people are much more likely to be food insecure. Again, single parent households, low income households, rental households. So this has an element of who has assets against which they can leverage, perhaps credit and so on. Transport is much more of an issue in Australia than it is in the UK, perhaps, because the distances are larger. In the USA, they've been measuring food security with this 18-question module for many years, and so they have not only an estimate of what it's like now, but how it has changed over the years. And so they have a 12.3% of low or very low food secure. So remember, these are the people who are either skipping meals or they are reducing the quality of the food that they eat. And children are more likely to be food insecure. The one thing I hadn't realised until I went on a visit there is that school holidays are 3 months long in the USA, not just 6 weeks like they are in the UK. And this is a big problem because it's all very well having feeding programs through school, but if school is out for 3 months, that's a long time to go without this kind of support. So people on low incomes, again, single-headed households, adults living alone, Black and Hispanic-headed households, and 59% of food insecure households participated in one or more of the federal assistance programs, which does suggest that those programs are not fully meeting those needs. Canada has a similar kind of percentage. Again, they've been measuring food security for a good while now, and so they kind of know not only what's happening now, but how it's developed. Again, the lower the household income, the higher the risk. The one thing that Val Tarasek in Canada has discovered is that you suddenly become food secure at the age of 65. And the reason is that you become entitled to have a pension. And so having this very steady income enables pensioners to cease being food insecure, even if they had been food secure, just by having a birthday. So we see across the 4 countries in front of us, very similar kinds of picture. So what sort of factors are associated with household food security? So these are the kinds of things that we see as influences of household food security, and some are different in some countries than others. As I've already mentioned, the distances in the US and in Australia are far larger than they are in the UK. So on my first visit to Australia, I was going to meet a colleague and I found the street on which the address had been given. And so I started walking along, and it was the first time I realised that in Australia you can walk along the same street for an hour and still not arrive at your destination. When I was visiting the Texas Hunger Initiative in the USA, I had a similar experience. I agreed to meet a colleague in a coffee shop on a certain street, and I got the taxi to drop me there. I was surprised to find that she wasn't there. So I checked my email. She hadn't messaged, so I messaged her and said, "I'm here. Will you be here soon?" And she said, "Well, I'm here too." And it turned out that there were 2 coffee shops with the same name on that particular street, and Google Maps told me that it would take me 30 minutes to walk between the 2. Fortunately, my colleague had her car, so she came to me. But this just brought home to me really how difficult it would be to carry vegetables for a family along those kinds of distances. And if the public transport's not easy and affording a taxi is out of the question, then people are restricted in what they have access to in a very real sense. That perhaps takeaways are the only thing that they have available, or corner shops where the fruit and vegetables are not very fresh and the prices are very high. We know what's associated with food security, but we don't know what associations are not causes. So here are a couple of examples from the Spurious Correlations website. This one says the correlation between revenue generated by arcades and computer science doctorates is very strong indeed. And the marriage rate in Kentucky is very strongly correlated with people who drowned after falling out of fishing boats. So we can very easily dismiss those correlations as spurious. But proving causation can be quite difficult. Usually for observational data, we use the Bradford-Hill criteria, which is what Richard Doll used to demonstrate that smoking causes lung cancer. In economics, instrumental variables are usually the methodology of choice. Directed acyclic graphs give us Pearl causality, and there are also new methods of causal algebras. Now the paper on the right is going to be out any day now on the Warwick Exchanges Journal, which is an interdisciplinary journal. And in here we discuss how the social sciences and the mathematical sciences need to collaborate to push forward our understanding of causality and causal inference. Food security has been a concern to policymakers for a little while now. So in 2009, DEFRA invited some of my colleagues to identify reasons why food security may be an issue requiring specific attention. And you can see from this map here that we have in the centre food supply security in yellow. And we can see on the right side we have the supply side, and then on the left side we have the consumption side. And so we have the sorts of things we've already identified, like infrastructure, storage and cool chain, technical changes, regulatory changes, changes in weather and climate, extreme events, biotic factors like human disease and hygiene, plant and animal disease. So this is thinking about things like variant CJD and the horse meat scandal. Land use, there's a tension between needing to have land for housing and land for food. How do we use that? And also for conserving the environment, for having enough pollinators and other things to actually maintain the food system. Then human capacity, and this is very topical here, where are we going to get the labour and skills for particularly if we have restrictions on who can come to work here in the UK. Water is very important, of course, it's part of the nexus, the food, energy, water nexus, but also fertilizers and pesticides and how these interact with preserving the environment and providing us with safe food. International factors, world trade, commodity prices, the recession, and the world population. All these things are going to affect our imports and our ability to have food available within the UK. There are political and governance factors. Obviously, government policies on various things do affect how much food is available. For example, if you really incentivize solar farms, then you might find that land given over to food crops might be smaller, particularly if those prices and the income derived from that is quite volatile, whereas the solar panels are more steady. Public opinion will influence policy as well. So access, we're thinking about financial access with food prices and the relative costs of healthier food. The shopping capacity, particularly time, and this is very important for people on low incomes. And very often they have 2 or 3 0-hour contracts and they're trying to juggle their time. So sometimes they've got a lot of money and sometimes they haven't got any time. So how do they actually do their shopping? Very often you might find that if shopping is difficult, as we've discussed before, the most rational thing to do to get through today might be to go to the local takeaway and feed the family. There'll be no waste, there'll be no cooking costs, and it won't take any time, or take very little time to do that. But that's not a very sustainable or healthy long-term strategy. So what's available, the quality and the quantity of that, what's available, and again, that can vary from locale to locale. If you are stuck with your corner shop, the quality and quantity might be different, the range certainly would be. What about taste and preferences and the social side of it? What about the nutritional knowledge? It has, for example, the change to food technology from cooking 20 years ago. Has that made a difference to people's overall cooking skills? And does that impact people on low incomes more than people on high incomes? That's the question. So we already know that this is a very complex system with lots of interactions. And then more recently, we've seen pictures like this from the Trussell Trust. So this gives us an idea that actually people accessing emergency food is on the increase. Obviously, the more food banks are available, the more people will have that option. But even taking that into account, the numbers are still going up. We can see that the number of emergency parcels passed the 1 million mark back in 2014, and it's still rising today. As you may remember, the House of Lords challenged the government on why this was a few years ago, and Frank Fields set up an all-party parliamentary group to investigate why there was an increase in hunger in the UK. And that report identified financial poverty as the principal driver of the increase in food poverty. And the fact that household food security is not routinely measured in the UK is still a problem. So here are some reasons why in the latest data, people have been referred to food banks. And we can see that 3/4 of it is low income, benefit delays and benefit changes. So this correlates very well with Frank Fields' report. But there are other reasons. Debt is a problem as well, servicing that debt and keeping a roof over your head. There's also the tension between heating and eating, and paying your rent or mortgage, paying your utilities and going without food. So typically people find that food is the most flexible item in their budget, because once the bill has come in, it's got to be paid, and they don't want to be out on the street or have their children taken into care because they're homeless or whatever. So they prioritise that and try and just juggle the food. So just do notice briefly that it's only a very small percentage, but domestic abuse is one of the drivers, and I will come back to that later. So have food banks really helped? Certainly in the short term they've helped. They are emergency supplies, and if I haven't got a meal today, then it's a great advantage to be able to access emergency food and not go to bed hungry. However, are they really helping the problem? So there is a lot of discussion about food charity being a sticking plaster for a cancer patient. So not addressing the cause, but only the symptoms. So this is an article which is on The Conversation about how food banks are highly visible, successful failures, and how they've morphed from emergency into industry. As they've made more and more contacts with big business and government and so on, they are becoming kind of professionalized and permanent, where they should really be just to get people over the hump. And working with people in the local food bank, they would love nothing more than to see their food bank close because there was no longer a demand for it. So food banks have been praised for reducing food insecurity and helping to solve the food waste problem by diverting tons of produce from landfill. These are two separate problems within the food system. By putting them together, you can kind of pretend that they're cancelling each other out, but actually those problems still exist. It's just that the effects are cancelling each other out to some degree. Martin Carraher says that they do depoliticalise hunger, addressing symptoms rather than causes. And it doesn't actually achieve a state of food security. It just gets somebody who's in a crisis over that particular crisis. It doesn't meet the demand. There are more people going hungry than there are availability of food banks. And it doesn't make up for the fact that wages are not rising, cost of living is rising, and the welfare state is shrinking. It's also taking over something which traditionally the state has been responsible for, so providing the minimal social security safety net. Food manufacturers and retailers typically want always to have full shelves when we walk into the store, because they worry that we will go to a competitor otherwise. But this inevitably makes a lot of food waste. So actually taking the food, the spare food, the waste food, and recycling it into food banks is a very useful service for them. So the UK Food Research Collaboration undertook a cost-benefit analysis and concluded that while there are benefits to diverting surplus food away from landfill, the reasons for pessimism outweigh the reasons for optimism, because the benefits of using food waste to feed people accrue primarily to the food industry, whilst absolving responsibility of the government to address food insecurity. So in all sorts of complex systems, we want to select policies for intervention, but how do we do it? A key question is, how can we network together inputs from disparate expert domains in a coherent way, taking account of inherent uncertainties so that different policy options can be compared in order to support decision making? So myself and my collaborator Jim Smith have contributed a methodology for doing this in a general setting, which we're beginning to apply now to the food security setting in collaboration with Warwickshire County Council. So what is an integrating decision support system? It's a statistical methodology to draw together inferences when the users are decision centres. So we're thinking about the county council, we're thinking maybe about government panels. They want to act as a coherent unit for a common goal, and there's not a combative atmosphere here. They know what their measure of success or utility looks like. They have an idea of how the system works, and they're agreed on that. They also know who they would ask about various aspects of the system and identify appropriate expert panels. And those disparate panels would give judgments or information about various aspects which would then be drawn together. And those panels themselves, you think of the Met Office, would typically have a very large and very complex model of their own by which they would use to produce the information that was required. So why don't we just build one big model? Well, it's usually infeasible. The computations would take forever. Nobody could say, well, I really own it. And as soon as there was a change, you'd have to completely re-parameterize the model. So there are technical conditions on having an integrating decision support system, and these are on conditions on the likelihood and the parameter space and the contributing evidence for coherent inference. And so this paper is, the technical paper is available on the archive, and there is the reference just there. So what do we require? We require it to be dynamic, because things change year to year or even month to month. We need to have a way of collecting evidence from all those different experts, and we need it to be coherent. We can't have different beliefs in different parts of the panel. We need to network these big probabilistic models which have an account for uncertainty. We need to think and evaluate the kinds of experimental and observational data and account for the differences in strength of evidence. We need to compare the policies that we are looking at and see which one we're going to do, which is going to be the most effective for the thing we want to achieve. It needs to take into account uncertainty, that there's uncertainty in the measurements, uncertainty in what we know and things like this. It needs to be able to update in time to make a decision. So a similar system called Rhodos was used, developed after Chernobyl. It's no good having a system like that. So, well, I need to know in half an hour whether I'm going to evacuate people or distribute iodine tablets, and the model takes 3 days to run. So it has to update in very quickly. And also when there is a scrutiny committee, or when the government calls a local authority to account, or the press get involved, you need to be able to defend your decisions to a regulator. So you need to, first of all, think about what is your measure of success, what is your utility. It may have several aspects to it, but it needs to be measurable. You need to know if an attribute has changed value and by how much. Interventions are usually on what's believed to be the causal pathway. So we need to assess how much evidence we have that that is a causal thing. And what we believe determines what we measure. It's important to be clear about these beliefs and the strength of any evidence of the underlying assumptions. And by going through the integrated decision support system process, we make these things very explicit. We need to agree on the utility, the class of utility functions, the sort of decision rules that might be examined. So what are the policy options in front of us? And also what influences what in what way. So we need to be able to unambiguously calculate the expected utility score for any decision and any utility function from the inputs provided for them by the panels. Now these things sound very technical, and indeed they are, but they are things which are commonly true, or can easily be made to be true. We want to choose the most appropriate panel and the most well-informed panel for the information, and this is something which we typically already do. So a little more on coherence. The coherency principle in Bayesian decision theory is the assumption that personal probabilities follow the ordinary rules for probability calculation. So probabilities will all add up to 1 or 100%, however you prefer to think about those. And here we have, suppose we have these two expert panels. One is giving evidence about the food supply system and one is giving evidence about the household income. If those two panels are relying on different probability distributions for the future price of oil, for example, then that introduces an incoherence into the system. But this is very easily resolved. What we do is we make another expert panel on the future price for oil, and we ask the household income and the food supply panels to say, given the information donated to you by the expert panel on oil, what is your estimate for household income and food supply, respectively? So once we have all this in place, there are a number of frameworks we have shown we can use, and importantly, these are very white box. So stage trees and Bayesian networks, chain event graphs, decomposable graphs, and multi-regression dynamic models will also all work under this framework. So here's a diagram from Manueli and James Smith's paper. This is particularly decision support for the nuclear industry, but the general framework is the same. So we start at the left, we appraise the values. So this means that we have all the policies that we want, and we give a score to each policy so we can rank them in order of likely efficacy, given the utility or this measure of success that we've already defined. So if we're happy with the ranking, we can go ahead and follow the top line. That's okay. We adopt the policy, we make a press release if that's appropriate, and so on, which of course it would be an emergency situation. But suppose there's a user query. Well, that seems a bit odd to me. Why policy 7 is better than policy 13? It's not intuitive. And then we can then examine the utility score. We can say, well, these are the different attributes we said are important. These are the way we weighted them. So this is more important than that. And this is how it was calculated. And that might clear up any kind of query. And if it does, again, we're okay. We go to the OK box and we adopt the policy. But suppose again that the query is still not satisfied, then we can start going back to the expert panels and we can say, your estimate for this quantity was this, with this amount of uncertainty. Can you please explain to us why that was? And we can undo it that way. So at every stage, we can then unfold the decision. And that means that anyone who needs to can justify their decision to an auditor, to the government, to the regulator. So Bayesian networks are one way we've been using these things. They're probabilistic graphical models, probabilistic because randomness and uncertainty play a role in predicting future events. So it expresses a conditional independent structure. So in this little graph, we have transport and food production influencing food supply and farmer incomes, and food supply influencing balanced diet. So what this graph is saying, if this is only an illustration, it's not meant to be realistic, we're saying that if we know food supply, then we know everything we need to know to estimate balanced diet. And if we know something about transport or food production, that doesn't give us any extra information, provided we know food supply. So we say that balanced diet is conditionally independent of transport and food production, given food supply. Now, these have to be directed acyclic graphs, so you can't go from one node back to itself by following the arrows. And we all know in complex systems there are inevitably loops. So what can we do? Well, what we can do is make it a dynamic Bayesian network and actually have several copies, as many copies as we need, of the network. And where there's a time link, as in the orange link between farmer incomes and food production, we can actually take that loop and make it into a directed acyclic graph again. So this, I have in mind that food production influences farmer incomes, but the farmer incomes in year one might influence food production in year two, because the farmer might think that they are not gaining enough income, and so they might go into some other diversification. They might go into catering, or they might go into something else, or holiday homes, and therefore food production will be affected or reduced. And we can do this for as many time steps as we need, and we can then estimate how the policy will unfold in the future. So with uncertainty quantification, there are lots of ways in which we need to estimate this. Typically, a panel would be asked to contribute at least the mean and the variance for the estimate that was required of it. So we'd have some measure of uncertainty. And also the scoring would be, we would use something called the Tower rules, or the law of total probability, in calculating the different scores for the different policies, so that we didn't end up with a situation where one policy appeared to score very highly, but actually was highly uncertain. So how do we go about actually building all of these things? We want to identify the utility function and its attributes, identify the models that the policymakers are going to use, what are the decision rules that we can have, and then we need to then put that into some kind of usable system by coding up the algorithms and making a graphical user interface and so on. So a recent book here has come up with a flowchart, and the only thing really I wanted to take away from this is that it's a highly iterative process. You don't just go through this flow once. You know, you say, have we got there? You test it. It's coming out with something unusual. The decision maker said, well, the reason that you're getting a funny result is you haven't included so-and-so. Well, we didn't know we had to include that. Okay, so we'll go around until it's actually producing something which we think are plausible on things which are less uncertain than the things we're going to estimate in the future. In practice, what do you do? Well, you get some experts around a board and you start rubbing out and adding in nodes, talking about where you're going to get your evidence from for different things, what are you going to call them. You know, can we collapse some of them into something called cost of living or something called capabilities and so on? And recognizing here that the household foods insecurity leads to the indicators of household food security, and that you may not be measuring exactly the things that you want. So coding this up, we have, these are all panels of experts, and this is something which we've got from working with Warwickshire County Council. Notice at the bottom we don't have a measure that says household food security. We have health, educational attainment and social cohesion. So these were the three things that we elicited from Warwickshire County Council that they were concerned about in regard to food insecurity. So having a situation where we don't routinely measure it, we asked them, well, what would you expect to see? They said, well, we expect to see health problems. So the hospital episode statistics we know have an increased rate of malnutrition either as a primary or secondary diagnosis. Educational attainment, it is known that on average, children who are entitled to free school meals do less well on their public exams than do children who are not. So if that number increased, then there might be expected to be a lower educational attainment. And also social cohesion. So in an extreme circumstance, there might be food riots. Although, to be fair, in Warwickshire, it's probably quite unlikely. That said, if it happened, it would be a very expensive thing to happen. So they were keen to keep that one in. And just a reminder that these are all expert panels. So we've done some work as well on pollination and policies for pollination. And that would sit inside the food production expert box. So there'd be, this is an illustration that there are complex models underlying each of these nodes. And then there's the other thing about whether the administrative boundaries add another layer of complexity. So thanks to Andy Davis of the Warwickshire Observatory for this slide. So there's Warwickshire sitting with its, as it were, arms around Coventry and Solihull and Birmingham. And the north of all those counties have a very similar social demographic, but they're obviously administered by lots of different local authorities. So we have the county boundary and the district and borough boundaries, and the parliamentary constituencies, and the electoral boundaries, and the ward boundaries and the parish boundaries. And then the locality boundaries, the clinical commissioning group boundaries, the LEP boundaries, and the police boundaries. And these don't always overlap and match up, so different interventions might be taken by different people. So this just adds a layer of complexity. So last of all, we've got our integration decision support system. How do we communicate the results? Well, the map you saw previously is one way we could do it, and here's another way we could do it, with on the left-hand side some bars giving the relative scores for the different strategies, and on the right-hand side a natural language explanation as to why, in this case, strategy 7 is preferred to strategy 2. And this helps the decision maker to have a reason to understand the reasons why strategy 7 in this case is scoring higher than strategy 2. And there might be some additional information that they want to take into account as they have their discussions about which policy to adopt. And they might say, well, actually, strategy 7 and strategy 2, they score very similarly. There is a little difference, but we know that strategy 2 would be far more politically acceptable than strategy 7, so we'll go with that. So in this way, they make the decision they want to make, but they have very clear reasons why they've done it. So this is an international issue, and we're working across disciplines. It's an international research collaboration on household food security in high-income countries. And I commend to you the work of Mariana Chilton, who's seated next to me in the blue. Her work on expert witnesses is really interesting. So she's been able to take people who are currently experiencing food insecurity to the US government to give evidence when they're trying to decide on policies and changing policies. And this program is called Witnesses to Hunger. And she's also done a Building Wealth and Health Network intervention, which is a complex intervention where people support each other. And they've seen a statistically significant reduction in food insecurity and also in depression, which are probably related. And this is all without providing any food relief. So this goes back to the idea that we had before, that these things are generally financially driven. So what does this say to us about policy evaluation? We've talked a lot about the integration decision support system. We talked a lot about how it helps us to evaluate policies before we implement them. But what about evaluation afterwards? So the hard thinking we need to do in order to build this decision support system automatically gives us a measure of success in our utility structure. We can sometimes call the evaluation of policy before implementation appraisal or ex ante, and ex post is the post implementation evaluation. So the evaluation of all the different policy options, the identification of the system and what influences what, can clarify what aims we have for the intervention itself and what our measures of success would be. So it protects us against goal drift or changes like this. So it keeps us rigorous in that sense. It keeps us honest. So what we need to do then is to measure the thing that we measured before and see if it has changed for the better. It also protects against goal drift. So one of the things that you sometimes find is that you start a policy and mid-policy kind of drifts a little bit. So one thing that springs to my mind when I think about this is the National Child Measurement Programme, which at the beginning was simply an observation. We need to collect data and see on the size of children. And then it changed to become something where BMI was used as an individual diagnosis tool, and parents were told that their children were overweight or obese and offered interventions, all with a very laudable intention to reduce obesity. And then there are studies which claim that if you tell a child who's 5 or 6 that they're fat, then the chances of them being obese at the age of 11 actually go up, not down. So this, I think, is a typical or a classic case of a very complex system being treated as if it's simple. So the structural side of things, the psychosocial elements are being kind of put to one side, and it's as if we as human beings were simply engines with fuel going in and fuel going out, and all it is self-discipline to take exercise and not eat so much, and that would be okay. So this is all very highly controversial, of course. So doing this kind of exercise will protect us against that, or at least identify that we've actually changed policy and so the thing we're measuring is not the thing we thought. And there can be unexpected outcomes, of course, positive or negative, and we don't need to exclude evaluating those. And in fact, they may well tell us about parts of the system which work differently than we thought. So in terms of scales, country level, household level, and Andy's slide about the administrative boundaries. So we have to remember that our beliefs shape our experimental design, but the integration decision support system thinking that goes into that actually makes these beliefs explicit. So we actually have stated up front what we believe, and I think this really helps us when we're trying to evaluate a policy. Was it successful? We've already set up what we think success looks like. We already sort of set up what we think the system looks like. We can gain extra information by making the intervention, and maybe we can make the next intervention better by doing that. So one question I was asked recently is, can this kind of setup help us to evaluate the effects of the implementation of multiple agencies? So the idea was that in this example, 3 agencies were all tackling the same problem, and there was some suspicion that the effects of one agency were cancelling out the effects of another. So how can we use this? And the answer is, of course, well, it depends. So supposing we have a system map that we believe to be the truth, and all of the agencies have this mental map in their heads, and they understand what influences what and what the causal pathways are, then we might be able to use it. However, we might have a system where actually one of the agencies says, no, but you're forgetting this part of the system also influences the problem, and that's what we're trying to tackle. In that case, you would end up with this problem being the lack of coherence in the system, because there were different probability distributions on parts of the system, and so in that case it would be very difficult, but at least the attempt would make things explicit. And thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Martine. Hi everyone, this is Martha again. We now have some questions. If you do have questions for Martine, please type them in and send them over to me via the question section in the question section in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. Martine, I'm going to start off with one question I've got here. One criticism of this IDSS approach might be that it is only as good as the experts using it. Is there a way that learning could be fed back into the process to mitigate against this?
Certainly, as I said, actually building the network in the first place is a very iterative process, and if there are disputes in amongst the panels, we can do things like sensitivity analysis. So you probably know we were working with the pollinator system, and there is a big divide in the scientific community about whether neonicotinoid pesticides are harmful or not at the kinds of levels that bees really experience them in the field. So what we can do in that situation, we can say, suppose one camp of belief is correct, what are the policies and how do they rank? And suppose the other one is correct, and how do the policies rank? And we can actually estimate how much difference that would make. The other thing is, if you're eliciting probabilities from expert panels, and I have some experience of this as well, what you can do is you elicit those in such a way that you can validate. So I'm thinking particularly of the IDEA protocol for eliciting probabilities from panels of experts. And what you do there is you ask the questions to each person privately, and they give you an estimate. And then you have a discussion, under Chatham House rules. So this was said, but not who said it. And people can say, well, I think it could be as high as that under these circumstances, or as low as that under these circumstances. And then everyone has a private second round where they give the estimates. In amongst those questions, there are some which are calibration questions, which the experts don't know the answer to, but the facilitators do. And we can use those to calibrate the model so that we can see how good individual experts are at estimating probabilities, which is actually quite a hard task. Most of us are fairly poor at it. So we can actually give extra weight to the person who performed very well. And so when we actually join in together the estimates from all those different people into a single probability distribution, we can do it in such a way that we are confident we have a measure of uncertainty on that, and we have put the most weight on the people who are giving us the most informative answers.
Great, thank you very much. I have a question here about policymakers using these tools. So how do the policymakers you have worked with respond to tools like these, which are intended to help tackle the complex decisions which are typically their job to tackle? So how have they responded to these tools?
So this is still work in progress. So we had to think very carefully when we were working with Warwickshire County Council, who are we aiming this at? Is it the elected members, or is it the council officers? And after some discussion, we found that it was probably better aimed at the council officers, because they're the ones who bring the recommendations to the elected members. So I think the key thing is going to be in getting this used, and certainly has been in the nuclear industry, is in how you present the results in such a way that the experts feel confident they understand them, the decision makers feel confident that they understand them. And in such a way that they can explore them to their heart's content, so they can actually really be positive about this. So typically at the moment, people rely on background papers. So this will just be an electronic analogue to that. So yeah, but communicating uncertainty is a challenge, and always has been, because typically if people don't understand about uncertainty so much, then if you say, well, the answer is 10 plus or minus 2, they'll say, well, you don't know whether it's 8 or 12, you don't know what you're talking about. So careful ways in which you can actually communicate uncertainty are very important with policymakers.
Mm. That's definitely a challenge that we're working with in CECAN as well. So next question is about, from the operational side, what software do you use to build your dynamic Bayesian networks? Are there free open source software available? And what are the best options for someone wanting to build their network point and click style, so not coding it themselves?
Right. So if you're just starting out, you could use Netica, which is what I used for the pictures that you've seen in this presentation. So Netica has a free version. I think you can only save up to 15 nodes, but the license is actually very cheap as well. It's a few hundred. So you can download the free version and play with that. That does actually have a point and click. So those nodes that you saw, I had them just as labeled boxes, but what you can have is the probability distribution. So for example, if you had a high, medium and low on any of those measures, then it would give you the probability of high, medium and low. It would all add up to 100%. And you could click on those and say, suppose we know that something has happened. Suppose we know that oil prices doubled, say. You can actually click on that. So oil price is high, you can click on that, and that bar will go to 100%, because that's something you've actually seen, so you know it with certainty. And then you can see how all the different probabilities feed through the network and come out at the bottom. So all the things that get changed as a result of actually making that observation can be seen in Netica. So that's a very good place to start, I would say.
Great, thanks for that suggestion. Is a question next about the time scales. So I know that you said that this is very dynamic and can work in real time. But so I guess this question's a bit more about the initial setup. They say that this approach takes a while to apply, months and years rather than weeks and months. How do you still make sure that you're timely?
So having set up the network, then it delivers decision support in real time. And having set it up, changing the network, saying we need to add in an extra node because there's been a government, say a national government change, so we need to change the slight structure here. And that doesn't take very long at all. So it's more about the discussions and the hard thinking that takes the time. So having got all that done, we could probably build it in a matter of weeks rather than months.
Okay. And then I've got a question from my part. I've been doing some work, ex ante work with the FSA and developing an evaluation or sort of structure for something they might use to help do their evaluation later on down the line. And I just had a question. You talked a little bit about how this might be used at other stages during evaluation, such as during or after implementation. Have you been working with this? Do you have anything to say about the challenges of getting these evaluation tools taken up by the decision makers themselves at later stages in the policy lifecycle?
Well, I think that actually from the food side, which is where I've been mainly involved, there is actually an increasing recognition that actually evaluation is really important. So when funding is applied for frequently, there is included in that sort of budget request money for the evaluation. And so I've been involved in a few instances of where I've actually helped design the kind of questionnaires or the data collection that they will need to make, genuinely good estimates of what they're interested in. So just the general statistical experimental design, so you make sure that you have no confounding between the two things that you're trying to measure and compare. So my experience is that actually evaluation has raised its profile recently.
Great. So we have just a couple minutes left, and that's two questions I'm going to ask. One is from one of our participants. It's, are there uncertainties associated with the final strategy scores the model gives?
No, the uncertainties are taken into account when deriving the scores.
Okay. And then, so I guess to close, I'd be interested, could you tell us a bit more about where you plan to go next with this work? What are the next big questions or developments on your agenda?
Well, obviously, we're looking at household food security. The next big thing would be to say, well, actually, let's look at the food, energy, water nexus, because we can't, although energy and water are in the food security network in some sense, maybe we want to actually increase the utility to include those. So what effect does the policy have on food security, but also what effect does it have on things like energy prices, water availability, and so on?
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Martine, both from me and on behalf of everyone here. For everyone else, for everyone here, we'll put the webinar recording and slides up on our website, cecan.ac.uk. Do check out the website to get in touch with anyone at CECAN or Martine if you have any more questions. That marks the end of our webinar today. A huge thanks to you, Martine, and thank you to everyone who joined us today to take part. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.